Well, my next guest is described as a really big deal in the space of gender equality and the fight against poverty. Delivering the keynote speech at this ACR Seeds of Change conference is Naila Kabeer, currently Professor in the Department of International Development and the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Naila Kabeer is not your average economist. She speaks directly about the human condition, performs fieldwork and compiles her own statistics. A renowned world leader in the fight against poverty and gender inequality. Professor Naila Kabeer, wonderful to be talking to you. Why did you accept this invitation to come to this ACR Seeds of Change conference here in Canberra?
Well, the area I've worked on mostly in discussing poverty has been about livelihoods and labour markets, and it's really focusing on advancing, expanding economic opportunities for women as one way that we might think about empowerment. And a lot of the focus tends to be on, there are certain topics that are more attention getting, if you like, and somehow I feel like large swathes of agriculture and farming and particularly food farming, these are issues that are hugely important for the planet, hugely important for the human condition and so on. So I thought, although I don't work specifically on agriculture, I do work on rural livelihoods. So I thought I would like to come here, maybe to learn from people who are practitioners very often in the field and, face to face with the sort of interventions that might be helpful and can teach me a little bit more about their, field-based challenges. So I kind of came to learn.
What have you learned? What's been the most exciting thing for you?
I think the most exciting, well, I don't know if it's the most exciting, but I think the most, it's of an enormous implications, is the extent to which the whole area of rural livelihoods, of farming opportunities, that gender is still struggling as an aspect of that whole research. I think there's been a lot of progress, but it's very clear from what I'm hearing that those people who have been in this field have been struggling for years to get others in the field and policymakers to acknowledge the huge importance of women's contribution to male farms, to their own farms, to rural enterprises and so on. So I think that's been a surprise, because to me it seemed very obvious.
Is agriculture still seen as a backward provincial, not of the aspirational classes in the wider debate of economics, or can it provide really great opportunities as a way to combat poverty?
I think there's, I've always felt, and I apologise to some of the policy people who might be listening to this, but I always feel that there's a tendency in the policy world to look for the next big thing, and I think words like cutting edge are very often used. And somehow I think a lot of agriculture doesn't lend itself to that language. And so, people want to talk about the fourth revolution and, new technologies and artificial intelligence. And I guess agriculture doesn't seem to feature in that conversation. However, I think growing attention to climate change and the environment, I think, is bringing home to people how important it is for us to conserve our natural resources. And in that conversation, I think agriculture is very central.
You said in your address that we must not conflate women's economic participation with women's empowerment. Mm-hmm. Do we make that mistake a lot?
I believe that, and I think I said in my keynote that, the feminists who kind of started to work with the concept of empowerment were doing something very interesting within the social sciences. They were shifting the analysis of power away from the perspective of the powerful, which is, how you dominate people, to the perspective of the oppressed. So empowerment was, how do people who are oppressed or subordinate in any way, how do they start to challenge the systems that oppress them? So we were always very rooted in an analysis of systemic power. I feel as the concept of empowerment, and both as economic but just empowerment, has traveled into the broader world, into the mainstream, it's become a convenient shorthand for things that people would like to encourage. I noticed it a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, when UNICEF in Bangladesh talked about empowering women to breastfeed. I mean, this was something they were doing around the world. Well, Bangladesh has one of the longest periods of breastfeeding in the world. I mean, children are breastfed for a very, very long time. So what do you mean you want to empower women to breastfeed? Well, what they wanted was to promote breastfeeding. So that was my first kind of inkling that the word empowerment was being used in rather instrumental ways. Now I think because of a lot of evidence showing that women's participation in the labor force contributes to economic growth, people have become very interested who don't have a real history in feminist thinking and so on. And for them now, I feel like very often they want to get women into the labor force. If that's going to contribute to economic growth, they want to get women into the labor force. I'm all for that. I don't have a problem with that. But I don't call that empowerment. Mm-hmm. It could be exploitation. It could be intensified work burdens. So we're really talking about promoting women's access to different kinds of material resources on terms that improve their ability to negotiate their own lives and to negotiate their relationships.
Because at the end of the day, unless women's incomes are increasing, then we're not winning in the fight against poverty.
I didn't get that.
At the end of the day, if women's incomes are not increasing, mm-hmm. then we're not winning in the fight against poverty.
We want women's income to increase because it's a part of household income, part of poverty, but we also want women's say and control over their income to increase. So if that income that they're earning is continuously being appropriated by more dominant people in the family, then all they're doing is working even harder for, their family's benefit, but it's not going to empower them if they have no say about things.
Why and how do you differentiate between the terms gender equality and gender equity? Explain why they are not one and the same thing.
Well, I think someone put it up on the board, and I kind of agree with it. Gender equity, both these terms have positive connotations and negative connotations. So the positive connotation of gender equity is that it acknowledges that men and women are under different kinds of constraints, have different ways of, different capacities to exercise agency, take advantage of opportunities, and equity requires us to acknowledge that difference and to make policies that address these very differential constraints. But gender equity can also be used to mean a kind of different but equal. Yes, men and women are different, doesn't mean they're not equal. And so I remember in one of these international conferences, we saw a shift away from the language of equity because some conservative governments were saying, yes, they're different, but they're equal. So they moved to gender equality. Feminists moved to gender equality. So gender equality can be very positive if it means equal life chances and life choices for men and women, equal opportunities to participate in the public domain, equal sharing of unpaid work in the domestic domain. That could be gender equality, or it could mean that I think the term is called harmonizing downwards. So rather than women closing the gap and catching up, everybody goes down, so then men just go down faster. So you've got gender equality, but it's in a condition, in a state of, overall declines.
You have termed the phrase justice equality when talking about gender equality. Why and what does that mean?
Have I done what?
Justice. You've termed the phrase justice equality?
I don't know if I've talked about justice equality. I think I've talked about gender justice.
Okay. Well,
yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the reason we started to use the term gender justice is because of the fraught nature of these conversations about equality and equity. And I think there is a whole philosophical literature about justice, and it allows us to move in the direction of not just individual empowerment of, those people who benefit from your project to looking at social personhood, citizenship. So it's trying to move the whole debate around empowerment beyond just changing the lives of individuals and individual men and women to looking at how do you promote equality of personhood at the level of the law, the state, and society. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
It does. I was just thinking, you wrote your first publication was how many years ago? Was
1994.
Okay. And if you look back to that, what you're writing now, to what you would write, what you're writing then to what you're writing now, how much has it changed in terms of your thinking and where we're headed?
Well, I'll answer the first and then ask you what you mean by the second. Interestingly, I don't think it's changed all that much. I think I was always interested in, first in understanding how ideas and theories contribute to inequality. You know, how invisibilizing certain experiences, certain kinds of work, certain kinds of people are how we keep systems of oppression going. Also in how the oppressed internalize their own inferiority. I've always been very, I want to know how you change people from within. So that whole thing of the subjective, of consciousness. So that interest has remained, you know, and I think it's become a bit more sophisticated in the sense that I've become much more aware of intersectionality. I've always focused on lower income people, but I think I've now tackling much more directly questions of caste and class and gender, which are the areas that have been of my main interest. So I think I would say there's been a real continuity, you know, in what I've been doing, but I think I've had the opportunity to explore in greater depth and with first-hand research what I was then talking about in more theoretical and based on other people's writings.
When you published first then and now, there's, you know, constant talk of capitalism is busted. It's dead. Is that a big difference?
That is a huge difference. I think several things have happened since that book. One has been the rise of militant Islam in my own country, in Bangladesh, which means that if I want to write about Bangladesh now, you cannot avoid religion. It is very much a part of people's everyday lives. And it's a particular form of Islam, which I don't think is indigenous to Bangladesh. I think it's, you know, coming through various influences and so on. The other is, of course, the way in which inequality can no longer be ignored. I think for a long time the development industry focused on poverty, and so did I. And I still think we need to keep that eye on poverty because there are still people in the world who are not able to feed themselves properly, who don't have their basic needs met. But I think we now can also not escape inequality. And the extent to which this preoccupation with growth that has taken over really since we moved into this whole neoliberal era and neoliberal globalization, what we're learning is that the fruits of growth are not evenly distributed. So what is the point of, you know, following this model if the vast majority of the world's population is not benefiting? And if these inequalities are turning people against each other, you know, there's divisions we see in society today, the divisions exemplified by Brexit, by the Trump phenomenon, and we're seeing it in other forms, and even the rise of militant Islam, I think are people who have felt somehow oppressed by the inequalities, but haven't looked for a radical solution. They've looked for a conservative solution, you know. They look at what divides us rather than what unites us.
It's been a thrill to talk to you. Are you hopeful about the world? Is it?
I call myself an optimist. I'm finding it very hard at the moment. And really, because I am now British and I live in Britain and I care about Britain, what is happening in Britain and the divisions that it's exposing is making it hard to be optimistic. I actually see the glimmer of hope in the rise of a political younger generation. That for a long time, I think I felt like, what happened to young people? We were always out on the streets. But I'm seeing, the whole extent to which around climate change, but also around Brexit, and I suspect the Brown Trump, young people seem to be fighting for a more just world, with justice now framed as the world is today than as it was before.
Professor Naila Kabeer, thank you for making the long journey from London to Canberra. We so appreciate it. Thank you.
And I'm very much enjoying being here. Thank you.